before we get too far into your books, I know that you studied under Dr. Schaeffer for a while, and I was wondering if you could give us a quick education on the two-story principle that you talk about specifically in Chapter 1 of Love Thy Body that Dr. Schaeffer developed and that you continue to build upon so that we can have a good foundation for the rest of our conversation.
Yeah, this was certainly one of the most important themes that I got when I studied at L'Abri. I don't know if you know this, but I actually became a Christian at L'Abri.
Oh wow!
Because I went there as an agnostic. I was raised Lutheran, and I say Lutheran rather than Christian, because I don't know if you know this, but Scandinavians are all Lutherans, just like Italians are all Catholic.
You are?
It's a very ethnic thing. So it was about in high school, about halfway through high school, I started asking questions about, how do we know Christianity is true? That's all I was asking. I'm going to a public high school. All my schools, all my textbooks are secular. All my teachers are secular. And so I just started asking, how do we know Christianity is true? And unfortunately, none of the people in my life, none of the adults in my life had any answers to that. There wasn't a lot of apologetics back then. I asked a Christian college professor, why are you a Christian? And he said, works for me.
Oh, wow.
That's it.
Yikes.
I had a chance to talk to a seminary dean, and I thought I'd get something more substantial. And all he said was, don't worry, we all have doubts sometimes. So with that kind of
Does
response...
anyone have any answers anytime?
Yeah, no kidding.
That's exactly what I said. Here I was just a teenager, about 16 years old, and I said, Christianity, I guess, just doesn't have any answers. And I very intentionally set it aside and embarked on a search for truth. I decided it was up to me to find truth. So I decided if there was no God, there was no purpose to life, there was no meaning, there was no foundation for ethics. There was not even foundation for knowledge. I became even a skeptic because I figured if all I had was my puny brain in the vast scope of time and space, the idea that I could know absolute universal truth was absurd, ridiculous. And that seemed obvious to me, that you couldn't hope to have any sort of real truth. At any rate, so you can see I was prime material for ending up at L'Abri because I had already become a relativist and a skeptic and an undeterminist. I decided we're just biochemical machines anyway, so there's no free will. So I had absorbed all of these isms from the secular world. And when I went to L'Abri, for the first time, I met Christians who were actually excited about talking about those things. Until then, when I raised my questions, with Christians, they always gave the impression there's something wrong with you, that you have these questions. Whereas at L'Abri, it was, oh, goody. We get to talk about interesting stuff with you. So it was quite impressive. And it was eventually, it took a year and a half, but eventually I did become a Christian through L'Abri. And to answer your question, one of the most important themes that Schaeffer talked about was the concept of truth itself has been divided. In other words, most cultures, most civilizations have known that there's a natural order and there's a moral, spiritual order. And they thought that they were both integrated into a single cosmological structure. There's a single cosmos, and therefore there's a single truth that applies to all of life and all of reality. But in the modern world, since the rise of modern science, people began to say, no, the only reliable knowledge we have is what we know by science, by empirical research, objective laboratory testing. And anything that you can't study under a test, stuff into a test tube and study under a microscope is not really true, not really real. So what does that mean for things like theological truths or moral truths? And people just decided they're not really truths. They are personal preference, personal feelings, your own private experience, what gets you through the night.
Right.
And so Schaeffer used to describe how truth had been split apart. He used the imagery of two stories in a building, so that science and empirical facts were on the lowest story of the building, and theology and morality had been thrown up into the upper story, where they were no longer considered really matters of true or false at all, but just, what's meaningful to you. And the reason this was so important is that this is the main reason that Christians have a hard time communicating Christian truth to their secular neighbors, is that when we make a truth claim, when we say Christianity is true, they automatically, unreflexively, it's a knee-jerk response, they throw it into the upper story, where they think you're just making a statement about your personal preferences. And they don't even hear it as an objective truth claim. And so for many people today, you have a two-step process. You have to help them understand what you even mean by truth,
right,
before you can explain that Christianity is true. And to make this personal, this is exactly what I had to go through when I was at L'Abri. I was such a relativist and skeptic that I first had to be persuaded that there was such a thing as objective truth before I could even consider whether Christianity might be that truth. So that's why it's such an important concept, because it really affects our ability to communicate Christianity. Hello, I'm Nancy Pearcey. I'm a scholar in residence and professor of apologetics at Houston Baptist University. And here's why you should never listen to the Reverend and Reprobate show ever.